Hit the like button, share your thoughts, subscribe, and tap the bell icon. The protagonist, Dr. Nathan Harrow, a reclusive xenobiologist, notices an alien woman scavenging through a rubbish bin near his isolated home on the outskirts of New Avalon, a human-colonized planet. The alien, disheveled and frail, looks like no species he has ever encountered, despite his years of studying alien biology. Compassion overrides caution, and Nathan invites her into his home, offering food and shelter. The alien woman, whose name sounds like Laureen, reluctantly accepts but remains wary. Through broken gestures and a rudimentary translation device, Nathan learns that Laureen is a fugitive, escaping persecution from a powerful galactic syndicate. As days pass, Nathan and Laureen attempt to communicate, bridging the gap through shared actions and emotions. Nathan introduces her to human culture while she shares glimpses of her world, including her people's unique psionic abilities, which humans have long theorized but never confirmed. Laureen begins to trust Nathan, revealing her tragic backstory. Her people were enslaved and exploited for their abilities, and she is the last of her kind. Tensions rise as Nathan realizes the syndicate might trace her to his home. The peaceful isolation of Nathan's life is shattered when advanced drones from the syndicate begin patrolling the area. Laureen's presence in his home puts him in grave danger. She insists on leaving to protect him, but Nathan refuses, vowing to keep her safe. They devise a plan to evade detection, using Laureen's psionics and Nathan's scientific knowledge to mask her presence. This shared effort deepens their bond as they struggle to outwit their relentless pursuers. Nathan discovers that Laureen's psionic abilities have a unique resonance that can disrupt the syndicate's advanced tech. Together, they enhance her abilities through improvised devices Nathan creates in his lab. Laureen's powers grow stronger, but using them takes a physical toll. Meanwhile, Nathan begins piecing together fragments of an ancient legend about her people, realizing she may hold the key to dismantling the syndicate's oppressive empire entirely. The syndicate closes in, deploying ground forces and advanced hunters. Nathan and Laureen are forced to flee from his home, embarking on a perilous journey through New Avalon's wilderness. Along the way, Laureen begins to heal from her trauma, and Nathan reflects on humanity's own history of exploitation and resilience. Their connection deepens, becoming more than just survival. The two form a plan to strike at the heart of the syndicate's operations. Nathan and Laureen infiltrate a syndicate facility to disable their tracking systems and gather evidence to expose their crimes. The tension peaks as they navigate deadly traps and face merciless soldiers. Laureen's powers reach their zenith, and she uses them to shield Nathan and disable the facility. In the climactic moment, Nathan broadcasts the syndicate's atrocities to the galaxy, sparking a wave of rebellion among oppressed worlds. Though victorious, Laureen's powers are nearly depleted, and she is gravely injured. The syndicate collapses under the weight of public backlash and internal rebellion. Nathan becomes an advocate for alien rights, inspired by Laureen's courage and sacrifice. Laureen, now free to live openly, decides to stay with Nathan, rebuilding her life on New Avalon. The story ends with hope as the bond between human and alien proves that compassion and courage can transcend even the deepest divides. Dr. Nathan Harrow tightened his coat against the biting evening wind as he trudged down the narrow path leading from the market. The streets of New Avalon were quiet this time of year, the usual bustle replaced by a somber stillness. Suited him. After years working in bustling academic hubs, he preferred solitude. His small house, nestled near the edge of the city, offered a peaceful retreat. But tonight that peace was disturbed. Nathan paused as he caught a flicker of movement near the rubbish bins outside his gate. Squinting in the dim light, he saw a figure hunched over, rummaging through discarded scraps. At first, he thought it was a stray animal, but as he stepped closer, the silhouette resolved into something unmistakably humanoid, but not human. The figure was thin, almost skeletal, with delicate limbs and skin that shimmered faintly under the street lamp, a hue somewhere between silver and violet. Her movements were quick and desperate, like a cornered animal. Her clothes, if they could be called that, were tattered and barely covered her form. "Hey," Nathan called softly, careful not to startle her. The figure froze, her large, luminous eyes locking onto his. They glowed faintly, reflecting the light like a predator's. Nathan raised his hands, palms up, in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. "It's okay," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not going to hurt you." For a long moment, the alien woman didn't move. Then, with painstaking slowness, she straightened, clutching a piece of stale bread to her chest. Up close, Nathan could see how gaunt she was, her cheekbones sharp against her skin. Whatever she'd been through, it had left her on the brink of starvation. "Come inside," he said, gesturing toward his house. "I have food. You don't have to do this." The alien hesitated, her eyes darting toward the street, then back to him. Nathan could see the conflict in her expression. Fear and mistrust battling with sheer desperation. Finally, she nodded, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. Nathan led her into the warmth of his home, his mind racing. Who was she? Where had she come from? And more importantly, what was she running from? As she stepped inside, the weight of her gaze lingered on him, filled with both gratitude and caution. Nathan had no idea what he'd just invited into his life, but something told him it would change everything. Nathan Harrow sat across from his unexpected guest in the softly lit confines of his small kitchen. The alien woman, Laureen, as she hesitantly gestured when he pointed to himself and said his name, sat hunched over the table, her thin, silver-violet hands clutching a mug of warm broth. She sipped it cautiously, her luminous eyes darting between Nathan and the room, as though expecting an ambush at any moment. "I bet you've had a rough time," Nathan said quietly, though he knew she couldn't understand him. Her gaze flicked up, her head tilting slightly at the tone of his voice. It wasn't much, but it was something. Nathan leaned back, his mind awhirl. He'd spent years studying alien physiology and cultures, but this was unlike anything in his textbooks. Her skin had an otherworldly sheen that shimmered subtly with every movement, and faint ridges along her temples seemed to pulse softly, in rhythm with her quickened breaths. She wasn't just different. She was unique. Nathan reached for the small handheld translator he'd salvaged from a research expedition years ago. It was outdated and clunky, but it might be his best chance at bridging the gap. He powered it on, and the device hummed to life, emitting a soft chime. "Laureen," he said, pointing to her. The device processed his voice, producing a short series of clicks and tones, his best guess at reproducing her language. Her eyes widened, and her lips parted slightly. She made a sound, a soft, musical hum followed by 2 sharp clicks. Nathan adjusted the settings on the translator and tried again. "Laureen." This time, the response was clearer. She nodded slowly, her body relaxing ever so slightly. "Progress." Encouraged, Nathan pointed to himself. "Nathan, Latan," she repeated, her voice melodic, the syllables reshaped to fit her own language. He smiled. Close enough. For the next hour, they worked together, exchanging names of objects in his house and piecing together basic ideas. Through trial and error, Nathan began to understand a few key things. Laureen was running from something or someone, and she was terrified. Every time he gestured toward the window or mentioned anything resembling outside, her expression tightened, and her glowing eyes darted nervously toward the door. "Who's after you?" Nathan asked, his voice low and even. He pointed to her, then mimed running, his fingers chasing each other across the table. Laureen stared at his hands, then slowly raised one of her own. She spread her fingers wide, and a faint ripple of light danced across her skin. Nathan froze, mesmerized. The air around her hand seemed to shimmer, almost as if heat waves were distorting it. Then, with a flick of her wrist, she mimed an explosion, her fingers splaying outward. Nathan sat back, his heart thudding. "Psionics," he whispered. The idea had always been theoretical, abilities tied to advanced neural networks in certain species, capable of manipulating energy fields. Humanity had never encountered it firsthand, though rumors abounded in galactic circles. Laureen's expression darkened, and she pointed to herself, then mimicked chains wrapping around her wrists. Her eyes brimmed with sorrow as she gestured outward, spreading her arms wide as if to encompass the universe. Nathan didn't need the translator to understand. Her people had been enslaved, hunted, and exploited for their abilities. She was the last or close to it. A knot formed in his stomach. "I'm so sorry," he murmured, though he knew the words meant little. Laureen gave a faint smile, her glowing eyes softening. She pointed to him, then placed a hand on her chest, a gesture that spoke louder than any words. Gratitude. The next morning, Nathan woke to the sound of a faint hum resonating through his house. Blinking against the early light, he followed the noise to his small workshop. There, he found Laureen sitting cross-legged on the floor, her hands hovering over a small metal sphere he used for calibration tests. The sphere floated inches above the ground, spinning slowly as faint ripples of light coursed through it. "Laureen," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. Her eyes snapped open, the glow within them intensifying. The sphere dropped, clattering to the ground, and she scrambled back, her posture defensive. "Wait," Nathan said, raising his hands. "It's okay. I'm not angry." She hesitated, studying him before relaxing slightly. Nathan crouched down, picking up the sphere. "You're incredible," he said, marveling at the faint scorch marks left on its surface. "I've never seen anything like this." She tilted her head, her ridges pulsing faintly as though trying to read his intent. Nathan gestured to the sphere, then to her. "Teach me." Laureen blinked, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she extended a hand, her fingers brushing the sphere. Nathan watched as it floated once more, the faint hum filling the air. It wasn't just a display of power. It was communication, a language beyond words. As Nathan watched, a chill ran down his spine. If the syndicate hunting her knew about this, they wouldn't stop until they had her, or worse. But as Laureen looked up at him, her expression cautious but hopeful, Nathan made a silent vow. The calm of the following days was a fragile thing, like a vase balanced on the edge of a table. Nathan and Laureen developed a tentative routine. She helped him with small tasks around the house, learning human tools and gestures, while Nathan continued deciphering her language with the translator and observing her psionic abilities. Every day revealed something new. Laureen's powers weren't just flashy displays. They were nuanced, capable of manipulating delicate objects with precision or generating fields of energy to deflect harm. Nathan's fascination deepened with each demonstration, but so did his unease. The syndicate wasn't just after her powers. They were after something unique, something Nathan couldn't yet define. The tipping point came one evening, just as the first stars began to dot the sky. Nathan was sorting through supplies in his workshop when the perimeter alarm blared. A shrill, repetitive tone that sent his heart plummeting into his stomach. "What?" He sprinted to the window, glancing outside. A dark, sleek drone hovered just above the tree-line, its crimson lights scanning the area. "Laureen," he called, spinning around. She appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. The faint glow around her temples brightened, and she tensed as though ready to flee. "It's them, isn't it?" Nathan asked, though he already knew the answer. Her gaze darted to the window, and she nodded. Nathan grabbed her arm, not forcefully but urgently. "We need to hide. Now." He led her down a narrow corridor to the basement, where his lab equipment was stored. The space was cluttered but secure, its walls lined with thick insulation to block external signals. Nathan ushered her inside and closed the heavy door behind them. Laureen paced, her ridges pulsing with a frenetic rhythm. Her hands flickered with faint light, psionic energy sparking to life before dissipating just as quickly. "Calm down," Nathan said, trying to steady his own breathing. "They'll scan the house and leave. They don't know you're here." But even as he said the words, doubt gnawed at him. The syndicate didn't operate on guesswork. They had resources, technology, and persistence. If they were here, it was because they'd tracked her. Minutes stretched into an eternity as the sound of the drone's hum grew louder, then softer, then vanished entirely. Nathan let out a shaky breath, but Laureen remained on edge. "We're safe," he assured her, though he wasn't sure if he was saying it for her sake or his own. The next day, Nathan scanned the perimeter with a handheld jammer he'd modified to detect syndicate tech. He found no sign of the drone, but that did little to ease his nerves. "Why now?" he muttered to himself as he worked in his workshop. "You've been here for days. What changed?" Laureen, who sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, tilted her head at his tone. "They're close," Nathan said, gesturing vaguely toward the window. He mimed the drone's movements, then pointed at her. They're after you." Laureen nodded grimly, but then she mimicked a small, deliberate motion, pointing to herself, then touching her head. "You're calling them?" Nathan's brow furrowed. "No, that's not it," she sighed, frustration evident. Closing her eyes, she held her hands out, and the air around her shimmered faintly. It was subtle but unmistakable, a ripple of energy radiating outward. Nathan's eyes widened. "You're emitting a signal." Laureen's expression darkened, and she nodded. "Of course," Nathan muttered, pacing. "They've got something tuned to track psionic energy. That's how they found you." He stopped, turning to her. "But you can't stop it, can you?" She shook her head, her ridges pulsing faintly with regret. Nathan rubbed his temples. Okay, we can work with this. If they're tracking you, then we need to mask the signal." He moved to his workbench, pulling out an array of tools and components. His hands moved instinctively, cobbling together pieces of old-tech power cells, resonators, signal dampeners. Laureen watched in silence, her glowing eyes narrowing as she studied his work. After a moment, she rose and joined him, gesturing to one of the components. "What? This?" Nathan handed it to her. She nodded and began rearranging the pieces, her movements precise and deliberate. Within minutes, they'd constructed a small, palm-sized device that pulsed faintly with a blue light. Nathan stared at it, impressed. "You're not just powerful. You're smart, too." Laureen gave a faint smile, but the moment was short-lived. The perimeter alarm blared again, louder this time. Nathan grabbed the device and turned to Laureen. "This has to work. If it doesn't—" He didn't finish the sentence. She took the device, her hands trembling slightly, and held it against her chest. Closing her eyes, she concentrated, and the faint shimmer around her seemed to dim. The alarm abruptly stopped. Nathan froze, waiting, listening. The silence was deafening. "It worked," he whispered. "It actually worked." Laureen opened her eyes, exhaustion evident in her posture. Nathan caught her arm as she swayed, steadying her. "Easy," he said, guiding her to a chair. "You've done enough for now." But even as he spoke, a shadow passed over the window, and Nathan's blood ran cold. The drone was back, and this time it wasn't alone. Through the glass, Nathan glimpsed the sleek forms of two more drones, their red lights sweeping the area like predators scenting blood. "Laureen," he said quietly, his voice taut. "We need to leave." Her eyes met his, wide with fear but resolute. She nodded, and together, they began gathering what little they could carry. As they prepared to flee, Nathan glanced at Laureen, her fragile frame illuminated by the faint glow of her psionic energy. No matter what happened next, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't letting the syndicate take her. Nathan's old hover truck roared to life as they sped through the dense forests surrounding his home. Laureen sat in the passenger seat, her eyes scanning their surroundings with a mix of terror and focus. The faint glow around her temples pulsed erratically, a clear sign of her heightened anxiety. Nathan gripped the controls, his knuckles white. The truck's outdated stealth plating barely masked their presence, and he knew the syndicate's drones wouldn't be far behind. "How far can they track you now?" Nathan asked, his voice tight. Laureen tilted her head, struggling to interpret his words, then pressed a hand to her chest where the signal-dampening device rested. She made a small, shrinking motion with her other hand. "It's weaker," Nathan interpreted, nodding. "But not gone." The device had bought them time, but it wouldn't stop the syndicate entirely. The faint psionic signal Laureen emitted was like a beacon, and Nathan had no illusions about how relentless their pursuers would be. "We need somewhere safe to stop," he muttered, glancing at the map on the dashboard. Laureen pointed suddenly at the map, her finger hovering over a mountainous region marked with restricted zones. "The old mining tunnels?" Nathan frowned. "That area's been abandoned for decades. It's unstable." She pressed her hand to her chest again, then gestured outward, mimicking an explosion. Nathan's eyes widened. "You can collapse the tunnels behind us." She nodded, her expression resolute. He hesitated, then veered the truck toward the mountains. "It's risky, but it's better than staying out in the open." The tunnels loomed ahead, their dark mouths yawning against the rocky hillside. Nathan parked the truck in a secluded alcove and led Laureen into the entrance, their footsteps echoing ominously. The air was damp and cold, and the faint hum of distant machinery suggested parts of the old mining equipment still operated, powered by forgotten systems. Nathan scanned the area with a portable detector. "These tunnels go deep. If we get far enough in, it'll take them hours to find us." Laureen nodded but hesitated, her glowing eyes narrowing as she glanced back toward the entrance. "What is it?" Nathan asked. She held up a hand, signaling for him to stop. A faint ripple of light emanated from her fingers, spreading outward like a wave. Her eyes closed in concentration, and the air grew heavy, as though something unseen pressed against them. Nathan held his breath, watching. The ripple returned moments later, bouncing back toward her. She opened her eyes, her expression grim, and made a quick, slicing motion with her hand. "They're already here," Nathan said, his stomach sinking. Laureen nodded, then motioned for him to move deeper into the tunnels. The deeper they went, the more the tunnels seemed to change. The rough, jagged walls gave way to smoother surfaces, etched with strange symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. Nathan paused, running his fingers over one of the markings. "This isn't human," he murmured. Laureen stepped beside him, her ridges pulsing faintly as she studied the symbols. She placed a hand on the wall, and a faint hum resonated through the stone. "These tunnels aren't just old," Nathan realized. "They're ancient." Laureen turned to him, her expression unreadable. She pointed to the markings, then to herself. "This is connected to your people?" She nodded, her glowing eyes flickering with something akin to hope. Nathan's mind raced. If the tunnels were tied to Laureen's species, there might be more here than just refuge. He pulled out a small scanner from his pack and began analyzing the walls. The readings were faint but unmistakable, traces of psionic energy. "This place was built by your people," he said, more to himself than to her. "But why here on a human-colonized planet?" Laureen didn't respond. Instead, she gestured for him to follow her deeper into the tunnels. The sound of distant thrumming grew louder as they descended. Nathan's heart pounded in his chest, but Laureen seemed drawn forward, her steps quicker, more confident. Finally, they emerged into a vast chamber. The ceiling arched high above, and the walls were lined with intricate carvings that glowed softly, bathing the space in an otherworldly light. In the center of the chamber stood a large, crystalline structure, its surface pulsating with faint light. Nathan approached cautiously, his scanner buzzing with activity. "This isn't just a shelter," he said, his voice hushed. "It's a generator or something like one. It's amplifying psionic energy." Laureen stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the crystal. The moment her fingers made contact, the chamber filled with a low hum, and the carvings along the walls flared brightly. Nathan shielded his eyes as the energy surged, crackling through the air. When the light dimmed, he looked back to see Laureen standing straighter, her exhaustion replaced by a quiet strength. "It recharged you?" he asked, astonished. She nodded, her expression calm but resolute. Nathan exhaled slowly. "This is why the Syndicate is after you. They don't just want your powers, they know your people built things like this. They want the technology." Laureen gestured toward the chamber's entrance, then mimicked an explosion again. "You're right," Nathan said. "If we destroy this, they lose their prize and their ability to track you." But even as he spoke, the sound of footsteps echoed down the tunnels. The Syndicate soldiers had arrived. Nathan turned to Laureen. Can you do it? Can you bring this whole place down? She nodded, her glowing eyes narrowing with determination. Then let's make sure they regret ever chasing you, Nathan said, gripping his scanner tightly as the first shadows appeared at the edge of the chamber. The footsteps grew louder as the Syndicate's soldiers drew closer. Nathan's pulse quickened, but Laureen remained calm, her eyes focused on the crystalline structure at the center of the chamber. The energy inside her had been replenished by the ancient technology, and now it radiated from her like a visible force. Can you really bring it down? Nathan asked, his voice a mix of awe and urgency. Laureen didn't reply. Instead, she closed her eyes, her ridges pulsing in rhythm with the surging energy around her. Her hands began to glow faintly, and the air in the chamber grew heavier, charged with an unseen power. Nathan felt a tingling in his own skin, as though the very atmosphere had shifted. Suddenly, the first of the soldiers appeared at the entrance of the chamber, clad in black, armored suits that gleamed under the dim light. Their helmets reflected the flickering lights of the crystals. Nathan cursed under his breath. They were too close. Laureen, Nathan whispered, now. The alien woman raised both hands, her fingers spread wide. The crystal in the center of the chamber responded, pulsing with an otherworldly glow. Laureen's energy surged, and Nathan felt a wave of power rip through the room like a shockwave. The crystals on the walls flared, their designs shifting, morphing into unfamiliar symbols as the chamber trembled. The first soldier took a step forward, weapon drawn, but before he could react, the air around him twisted, and the ground buckled beneath his feet. A burst of energy surged outward, sending the soldier crashing into the far wall, his body slamming against the stone with a sickening thud. The rest of the squad didn't hesitate. They opened fire, energy blasts crackling through the air toward Laureen. Nathan dove for cover, his heart hammering in his chest as the shots rang out. Laureen, he shouted, but she didn't flinch. Her energy shield flared to life around her, glowing bright and pulsating with her psionic power. The shots splintered against the shield, deflecting harmlessly away. Then, with a roar, she raised her hands, and the chamber itself seemed to respond. The floor beneath the soldiers cracked open, stones splitting apart like a shattered mirror. The soldiers stumbled, disoriented, but they quickly regrouped, moving toward Laureen with calculated precision. Nathan's mind raced. They couldn't fight them head-on. Laureen was powerful, but there were too many of them. And the Syndicate had resources, more advanced tech, more firepower. Focus on the crystal, Nathan yelled, scrambling to his feet. That's our only chance. Laureen's eyes locked with his for a split second, and then she nodded. With a final, defiant gesture, she unleashed a torrent of energy at the crystal. The chamber shook violently as a massive burst of light erupted from her, funneling toward the crystalline structure. The energy blast hit the crystal like a hammer strike, and the entire chamber seemed to warp, the air distorting as the crystal cracked, its surface splintering. The soldiers hesitated for a moment, uncertainty flashing across their faces as they tried to adjust their aim. But it was too late. The crystal shattered with a deafening roar, sending a shockwave through the room. Nathan felt himself being thrown to the ground as the power of the blast rattled the entire chamber. The walls crumbled, and the floor beneath him cracked wide open. Dust and debris filled the air, and the world seemed to blur around him. When the dust finally settled, Nathan struggled to his feet. His ears rang, and his vision swam, but he could make out the shape of Laureen standing amid the wreckage. Her energy shield flickered weakly around her, but she was still standing. The soldiers were nowhere to be seen. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. Laureen? She turned to him, her glowing eyes filled with exhaustion but also something else. Triumph. She had done it. She had destroyed the crystal and severed the Syndicate's link to her psionic signal. But there was no time to savor the victory. The rumbling beneath their feet was a warning, a sign that the entire structure was collapsing. We need to go, Nathan said, urgency flooding his voice. Laureen nodded, her expression grim. She pointed toward a narrow tunnel at the far end of the chamber. Can you collapse it from the outside? Nathan asked, motioning toward the tunnel entrance. Laureen hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the walls. Then she nodded again. "Do it," Nathan said, grabbing her arm. "I'll cover you." As they ran toward the tunnel, Laureen began focusing her energy, her hands glowing brightly as she reached out toward the crumbling chamber. The walls groaned under the pressure of her psionic manipulation, and Nathan felt a tremor in the ground beneath them as large chunks of stone fell from above. They barely made it to the tunnel before the first rocks began to fall. Laureen thrust out her hand, and the debris stopped mid-air, suspended by an invisible force. Then, with a quick motion, she hurled it back toward the chamber, sealing the entrance behind them. The tunnel trembled as the last of the rubble fell into place, blocking the path. Nathan exhaled a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "We're alive," he murmured, his voice hoarse. Laureen gave him a faint, weary smile. She was on the edge of collapse, but there was a quiet pride in her expression, as if she knew she had just turned the tide. "Thank you," Nathan whispered. "You saved us." But even as he spoke, he knew the danger wasn't over. The syndicate would come again. They wouldn't stop until they had Laureen, until they had what she represented. But for now, in this moment, they had won. And that victory was enough. Laureen nodded, then turned her eyes toward the narrow path ahead. There would be more challenges to face, more battles to fight. But they would face them together. As they ventured deeper into the tunnels, the faint glow of Laureen's energy illuminated their way. They didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, Nathan allowed himself a small glimmer of hope. The deeper they ventured into the underground network, the more the oppressive silence of the tunnels settled around them. It was a stillness that almost felt unnatural, as if the walls themselves were listening. Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though he had no idea by what or whom. Laureen seemed to sense it too. Her posture was tense, her senses heightened as she moved cautiously through the labyrinthine passages. "How much farther?" Nathan asked, trying to keep the unease out of his voice. Laureen paused, her glowing eyes scanning the tunnel ahead. She made a gesture with her hands, indicating distance and then an uncertain shrug. She couldn't communicate everything clearly in words, but Nathan understood well enough. She wasn't sure. The tunnels were ancient, winding, and twisted. They hadn't been touched in centuries, perhaps longer. The walls, though smooth in places, were streaked with moss and ancient symbols, some of which seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. Nathan tried to ignore the creeping sense of dread that seemed to follow them. He focused on the path ahead, keeping his mind sharp. They needed to get out. Laureen had brought him here to find something important, he thought. Something that would make the destruction of the Syndicate's crystal worth the risks they had taken. "Laureen," he said again, his voice firm. "What exactly are we looking for? Is there something down here that can help us?" She looked over her shoulder at him, then glanced at the walls. Her hands moved in a series of rapid gestures, circling motions, then a downward thrust, and then a flick of her fingers toward her chest. "I don't understand," Nathan said, his brow furrowing. "Are you looking for a weapon?" She nodded, then mimicked the motion of a large object with her hands. "A ship," he ventured, growing more confused. Laureen shook her head, her expression softening as she took a few steps ahead. She paused again, then held up her hands, the air around her vibrating faintly with energy. "A power source," she said, her lips moving slowly, with effort. "Old. Forgotten." Nathan blinked, comprehension dawning. "You're looking for something to fight the Syndicate, something powerful enough to stop them." Laureen nodded again, her energy shield still flickering faintly around her. They walked in silence for a while longer, the air growing colder as they descended even deeper into the tunnels. Then, abruptly, Laureen stopped and pointed to a wall that seemed different from the others. It was smooth and dark, with an intricate pattern of lines etched into its surface. Something like a door, but hidden in plain sight. "This is it," Nathan whispered, stepping forward. He ran his fingers over the markings, trying to make sense of them. They weren't human, but the symbols felt strangely familiar. They seemed to be instructions. A guide to opening the door. Laureen stepped up beside him, her eyes glowing brighter as she reached for the symbols. Her fingers hovered over them, and she muttered something in her native tongue. The symbols shifted under her touch, glowing faintly in response. Nathan watched, wide-eyed, as the wall before them began to pulse with light, the markings rearranging themselves like a complex puzzle. Slowly, the wall split in two, revealing a hidden chamber beyond. Inside, in the center of the chamber, lay a large crystalline structure. This one was different from the crystal they had destroyed earlier. It was larger, more intricate, and its energy radiated with an intensity that made Nathan's chest tighten. "Laureen, is this it?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, a spark of recognition lighting her features. "This is what we need," she said, her voice hoarse but clear. "This will power the weapon." Nathan stepped into the chamber, feeling the hum of the crystal reverberate through his bones. He could almost taste the power emanating from it. It was unlike anything he had ever felt. Pure, untapped energy, just waiting to be harnessed. Before he could reach the crystal, a sudden, sharp sound echoed through the tunnels. A burst of static, followed by the unmistakable hum of machinery. "Laureen!" Nathan spun toward her, but she had already raised her hands, her energy flaring in a protective arc around them. It was too late. The shadows in the chamber shifted, and figures stepped out from behind the stone pillars. Nathan's blood ran cold. The last thing he expected to see here, in the heart of this ancient, forgotten place, was a group of armed men in syndicate uniforms. "Did you really think you could escape us?" The voice was harsh, cold, and all too familiar. Nathan's heart sank as a tall figure stepped forward, his face hidden behind a mirrored helmet. But Nathan didn't need to see the man's face to recognize him. The leader of the syndicate's hunters. The one who had been hunting Laureen for days. "You've been following us," Nathan said, his voice tight with disbelief. "You were never far behind." The leader's helmet tilted slightly, a mocking gesture. "Of course. Did you think we wouldn't track her here?" He stepped closer, the sound of his boots echoing ominously through the chamber. "You really should have known better, human." "Laureen," Nathan said urgently, his eyes flicking toward the crystal. "We need to destroy I now." But before Laureen could respond, the syndicate soldiers moved into position, weapons raised. "I don't think you'll get the chance." The leader's voice was smug, his fingers tapping on the side of his helmet. "We've been waiting for you to open the way. And now we'll take everything you've found." Nathan's mind raced, but there was no time. Laureen's energy flared around her, but it was already clear that she was outnumbered. The syndicate had been waiting for this moment, and their trap had sprung. Nathan's gaze hardened. "You're not taking her," he said, his voice steely. He stepped forward, his hand instinctively going to the knife he kept hidden in his jacket. The leader's laugh was cold, like the sound of ice cracking. "You really think you can stop us? You're just a human." "I'm more than that," Nathan growled, his eyes burning with determination. But just as the tension reached its breaking point, the ground beneath them trembled. The crystal's light flickered, and a deep, resonant hum filled the chamber. Laureen's hands shot up, her energy flaring out of control. She was pushing the limits of her power, tapping into the crystal's energy with an intensity Nathan had never seen before. For a moment, everything went silent. And then, with a deafening roar, the crystal exploded. The explosion that followed was like nothing Nathan had ever experienced. The air around him seemed to warp, the sound deafening as the crystal's immense energy released in a blinding burst of light. It was as if the very fabric of reality had been torn apart. The chamber shook violently, and the ground beneath his feet cracked open. Nathan felt himself thrown backward, his body slamming into the stone wall with brutal force. His vision blurred as pain exploded across his chest. For a moment, everything was silent. The world was spinning. When Nathan managed to open his eyes, the scene before him was nothing like the chamber they had entered. The walls were cracked, the air thick with smoke and dust. The glowing crystal at the center of the room had been obliterated, its remnants scattered like shards of glass. "Laureen!" Nathan gasped, forcing himself to his feet. His heart slammed against his ribcage as he scanned the wreckage. Laureen was on the ground, her body motionless. Her energy shield flickered erratically around her, barely hanging on. "No!" Nathan's voice cracked as he stumbled toward her. His hands shook as he gently turned her over, his eyes searching for signs of life. Her glowing eyes were dim, and her breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible. "Laureen, no," Nathan whispered, his voice breaking. She opened her eyes slowly, her gaze meeting his, filled with exhaustion and something else. A deep, quiet sadness. "I couldn't control it," she whispered, her voice strained, barely above a breath. "The power, it was too much." Nathan's chest tightened with a mixture of fear and helplessness. "You've used too much energy. You're going to be okay, we can—" But she shook her head weakly. "I won't be okay." She managed a small, faint smile. "I'm sorry, Nathan. I gave everything I had. The crystal was our last chance. It was the only way to stop them." His throat tightened, and his eyes burned. He didn't know what to say. She had saved them all, destroyed the Syndicate's path to her people's power, but at a cost he hadn't imagined. "Laureen, you've done more than anyone could ever ask," Nathan said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've saved me. You've saved everyone." She gave him a faint nod, her hand reaching out weakly to touch his. "You're not just a human, Nathan. You've shown me what it means to fight for something. You're more than what they said, more than I thought. You've given me hope." Tears stung Nathan's eyes as he grasped her hand tightly, not wanting to let go. He couldn't lose her. "Laureen, please," he said, his voice cracking. "You can't go. Not now. You're the last chance. You—" But she shook her head again, her expression serene despite the pain. "The crystal, it's gone. I've given it all. There's nothing left for me, Nathan. But you—" She coughed weakly, the effort of speaking clearly taking a toll. "You have what it takes to rebuild. You have the strength to stop them." Her words hit him like a freight train. She was right. There was nothing left of the Syndicate's crystal. Their most powerful weapon, their control over her and her people, had been shattered. But in doing so, Laureen had burned through every last ounce of her energy. She wouldn't survive this. Not unless— "No, I can't do this without you," Nathan said, his voice desperate. "I won't." But she squeezed his hand gently, her glow dimming further with each passing second. "You can. You must." Her voice was faint now, the power fading from her. "The fight, the war, it's yours now, Nathan. You must stand for the future of my people, of everyone." Her words echoed in his mind, louder than the hum of the destroyed crystal. He had never signed up for any of this. He was just a man caught in the crossfire of forces beyond his comprehension. But Laureen had believed in him. She had trusted him with a mission that was larger than anything he could have imagined. And now, as she lay dying in his arms, he understood. He had no choice. "Laureen," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "I won't let you down. I'll finish what you started. I swear it." She gave him one final, tender smile, her energy completely fading now. The faint light in her eyes dimmed, leaving only the faintest spark of hope in her expression. With a final breath, Laureen's body relaxed, her hand slipping from his. Nathan felt a heavy weight settle in his chest, an emptiness he couldn't fill. He had lost her, and no words would ever bring her back. But her sacrifice, the fire she had ignited, would not be in vain. Nathan closed his eyes, pressing his forehead to hers for a moment, gathering the strength he would need. The Syndicate may have taken everything from Laureen, her people, her power, her life, but they would never take her legacy. He rose to his feet slowly, his mind already racing with plans. He would finish what Laureen had started. He would find a way to rebuild the resistance, to fight back against the forces that had caused so much destruction. It wouldn't be easy. It would take every ounce of his resolve. But for Laureen, for the memory of her sacrifice, he would fight. The last of the Syndicate's hunters would not get away. They had underestimated humanity. They had underestimated Nathan. With the final remnants of Laurine's light fading from the chamber, Nathan made his decision. The war was far from over. It was only just beginning. The end. Thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stellar HFY content. Ring that bell to stay updated, and we'll see you next time.